A recent home invasion in Placer County is just the latest example of released inmates committing violent crimes when they're supposed to be behind bars. The sheriff's department says there's no room in the jail, but whistleblowers point to hundreds of empty jail beds.
So what can be done to keep violent suspects off the street? Julie Watts is getting answers.
This is a storybook neighborhood tucked away in Rockland, California, the second safest city and one of the safest counties in the state, which is why so many were so shocked by a nightmare on the Christmas street. It's a street where everyone knows everyone.
It's a beautiful, beautiful neighborhood. Every house has a different theme to it.
Known as the Christmas street.
Yeah, well over 100 of these homes.
Because of their famous neighborhood light show. But as the weather turned warm,
this is the Christmas street.
Christmas Street became the scene of a neighborhood nightmare.
I've always considered this a sanctuary. It's just monumental that something like this could happen here.
Stephen McDonald, who still fears for his safety and asked we conceal his face, was jolted out of bed on an early May morning by someone trying to break through his doggy door with his patio chair.
The way he was beating on the house, I thought, well, he's going to break through the glass.
After yelling down to the stranger in the backyard, the former Sacramento County Sheriff's deputy went out front to investigate.
He just sprinted down the street.
But when Stephen went back inside to call 911,
he bolted from the front door and hit me at full speed.
He says the suspect pinned him down and beat him for what felt like an eternity.
I was caught like this, so he was just standing there pounding on the sides of my head. And he went on how about he was going to kill me. He felt that he was a messenger from God, and I was fighting for my life.
The suspect, Bradley McClung, was charged with attempted murder. But adding insult to Stephen's injuries, he'd been released from the Placer County Jail less than 48 hours earlier, his fourth release in 5 months without posting bail.
It staggers the mind to think that anyone near that capacity is even qualified for a release of any sort.
It's a failure of our sheriff's policy, and we need to fix it.
Whistleblowers inside the sheriff's department point to what they call an unnecessary catch and release policy in Placer County. But the sheriff's department says they must release inmates under the federal consent decree, a 1993 judge's order that says the sheriff is authorized to release inmates when jail capacity hits 90%.
It's not a must release, it's a may release starting at 90% capacity.
But we've reviewed months of jail capacity records, and week after week,
38 released.
Dozens of inmates are being released.
400 available beds.
Despite hundreds of empty beds.
The jail is well below 90% overall capacity, yet you're releasing dozens of inmates a week.
Because we don't consider overall capacity.
Lieutenant Resendez explains the jail has several classifications of inmates, and their interpretation of the order allows them to release inmates when any one of those classifications is at 90% capacity. That may be COVID isolation pods, where inmates spend their first 7 days, or space in the cells they'll be sent to after, classified by security level.
Sometimes we have to release the best of the worst to make room for the new one.
That includes roughly 100 inmates ineligible for bail by court order, released into the community anyway since January alone. 47 so-called no pickups that Placer County chose not to pick up and bring into the jails, and another 56 who were simply allowed to walk out of these jails unsupervised. Suspects deemed too risky for a judge to grant bail.
So are you saying that the judge's order doesn't matter?
I'm no way saying that the judge's opinion or the DA's opinion on no bail doesn't matter.
Well, in 56 cases so far this year, it didn't matter.
Well, because 56 times we were faced with the decision of who to release versus who to keep.
But you do have available beds.
Whistleblowers point to 2 empty dormitories like this, known as L&M pods, with 100 total unused beds, roughly the same number of no-bail inmates they've released so far this year.
We've had those beds available for over a year, and they've remained empty, and it's a choice to not open them.
Whistleblowers say they could move lower-risk inmates here to make space in other classification pods.
Why not open up L&M so the McClungs of the world don't have to be released back out into the public?
The very short answer to that is we currently don't have the staffing to run those.
He says people are retiring faster than they can hire and points to COVID complications, but whistleblowers note they've had over a year to hire the 5 people needed and give examples of how staff could be moved around to reopen those pods.
We have the ability to do it. We've chosen to not do it.
To recap, jail records indicate the Placer County Sheriff's Department is releasing dozens of inmates a week, despite hundreds of empty beds. Now, the department points to a federal order that authorizes the sheriff to release inmates when jail capacity hits 90%. But whistleblowers point to 100 beds that have been sitting empty for over a year. We started asking questions, and the Sheriff's Department now says they are actively working to staff and fill those beds. But there are also questions about why certain inmates are being released despite red flags.
What do you say to victims like Mr. McDonald?
Our hearts go out to the McDonald family for what happened to him. We have no way of knowing what people are going to do once they're released from custody, and we can't possibly keep everybody in jail.
But repeat offenders, people who keep coming back to you week after week?
He had some pretty minor crimes.
Bradley McClung is now facing a litany of charges, including premeditated attempted murder of Mr. McDonald, after being released from jail 4 times this year for a series of escalating charges related to trespassing, vandalism, and drugs. But he previously served prison time for convictions related to an unprovoked attack on a Walmart employee in a bathroom and later attacking his pregnant girlfriend. And he also had prior serious convictions related to burglary.
There's no excuse for releasing people that have a violent criminal history.
So this guy's violent history was 10 years old, and your policy says they only consider 5 years.
Correct. That's why it's a failed policy.
Whistleblowers inside the Sheriff's Department point to the policy used to decide which inmates to release. It only refers to assault convictions in the last 5 years.
Is there nothing that says maybe we shouldn't release a guy who's a flight risk, who has a history of violence, and who has been released 4 times in 5 months?
At the end of the day, we have to look at their current charges. We can't predict what they're going to do.
When somebody comes back to you 4 times in 5 months, you can predict they're probably going to come back again.
Whistleblowers also point to Dennis Lynch, accused of stabbing and killing his mother and her boyfriend, prominent Sacramento lobbyists. Lynch had been released twice in 2 months following arrests related to vehicle thefts. But records reviewed by CBS 13 reveal Lynch had been flagged in more than half a dozen so-called end-of-watch reports, distributed widely throughout the Sheriff's Department at the end of each shift. He wasn't arrested, but his family reported he'd stabbed the family dog twice in the neck last year. And the next day, reports note he threatened to blow someone's head off with a .45. A day later, officers notified a nearby school that Lynch might pose a threat. Other reports note Lynch was recently released from a mental hospital, had violent tendencies, and warned deputies that Lynch carried a large sheathed knife at all times.
One of the sheriff's flaws in our procedure is we don't search those people's names in our end-of-watch reports.
When Lynch was arrested a few months later, he was twice released without posting bail despite alleged violent tendencies. Then just days before the alleged murder, a gun store owner warned the Sheriff's Department that Lynch illegally attempted to buy a gun.
How do these repeat offenders who keep showing up in court impact the courts and, by extension, the taxpayers?
Each one of those results in another court appearance, another set of warrants, and all of that is more work and more time.
And Jake Chatters with the Placer County Court notes that comes at a cost to taxpayers. There's also the issue of supervision.
If they're released from jail under federal consent decree, they're released unsupervised.
That's my understanding.
So a judge may order supervised release instead of sending them back to jail, so they can at least be tracked through an ankle monitor or probation officer. Instead of being sent back to jail, Lynch was on supervised release when his parents were murdered.
Can you see how your policy ties the hands of judges?
It's hard to say that that's the case for every single release.
But you acknowledge that it is...
It is a challenge, and our entire system is full of challenges.
We shared various suggestions from whistleblowers for relocating staff to open up the 2 empty pods with the 100 unused beds, keeping more inmates like McClung and Lynch off the streets while they await trial.
My biggest question is, why didn't we do it over a year ago?
We've been hearing a lot of excuses, but not a lot of solutions. Can you assure us that there is a solution that's in the works?
It's safe to say that there is a plan in place to get them open in the near future.
If we can open up those beds and increase jail capacity, then that's a win.
And that's why you're doing this.
That's exactly why I'm doing this.
Stephen, a retired sheriff's deputy himself, is hoping for a change in policy to start looking beyond just recent charges before releasing inmates with violent histories unsupervised into the community.
Every single person coming out of there needs a full-on evaluation.
And he hopes they're making changes following the nightmare on Christmas Street.